What happens when the woman you mocked for a decade is the only person capable of destroying a global criminal syndicate in under 1 hour? Marcus always believed I was just a timid clerk who was too terrified to correct a barista. He is about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. My silence was never a sign of weakness. It was the iron discipline of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Harper James. The ambient lighting of the most exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago did absolutely nothing to soften the suffocating tension surrounding our table. The heavy crystal glasses clinked harmoniously, the silver cutlery scraped gently against expensive porcelain plates, and the low hum of wealthy patrons filled the background. Yet, to me, the air in our private booth felt thick enough to cut with a tactical combat blade. I sat perfectly still, my posture strictly neutral, taking a slow sip of sparkling water as I observed the grotesque psychological theater unfolding directly across from me. To my left sat Marcus, my ex-husband, a man whose massive ego always entered the room a solid 5 minutes before his physical body actually did. Across the mahogany table was our daughter, Chloe. She was just 19 years old and usually brimming with a fierce, uncontrollable, independent fire that I always admired. But tonight, that bright fire was entirely extinguished. Her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. Beside her sat the undeniable reason for her extinguished spark. He was the man she had just introduced as her new fiancé, Julian Vance. Julian was significantly older, draped in a flawlessly tailored bespoke suit that screamed of quiet, dangerous wealth. He smelled of expensive leather and heavy cologne. He smiled constantly with his mouth, flashing perfectly white teeth, but his dark eyes remained entirely dead, calculating, and ice-cold. I watched as he casually rested his large hand on the back of Chloe's neck. To an untrained observer, it might look like a gesture of affection. To me, it was a classic, aggressive physical dominance display. His fingers curled slightly, a silent reminder of who was in charge of her physical space. Marcus swirled his aged whiskey in his glass, chuckling loudly at his own supposed brilliance. He had been talking nonstop for 45 minutes about his booming real estate firm. He loudly boasted about closing a massive commercial deal worth over $5 million just 2 days ago, claiming his profits were up by 60% this quarter. He loved the sound of his own voice, completely blind to the dark undercurrent swirling at the table. Eventually, as he always did, Marcus turned his sights on me to inflate his own fragile self-worth. "So, Harper," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with heavy condescension as he leaned forward, "are you still typing away in your pajamas all day? How is the thrilling world of remote data entry treating you? Is Meridian Apex Enterprises paying you enough to keep the lights on? Or are you still just making sure the boring spreadsheets align properly?" I let his pathetic insults wash over me without a single twitch of a facial muscle. For a decade, I had carefully cultivated this exact persona. I was the timid, unremarkable corporate drone who would never dare to speak up against anyone. I offered him a mild, practiced, slightly embarrassed smile. "It pays the bills, Marcus. It is very steady work, and I appreciate the quiet routine," I replied softly, my tone completely devoid of any challenge. Marcus scoffed loudly, shaking his head in mock pity. I immediately tuned out his obnoxious laughter and focused entirely on the real threat in the room. My deep operational training kicked in seamlessly, analyzing every single micro-expression and subtle shift in posture across the table. When the waiter arrived to ask Chloe what she wanted to order for her main course, Julian answered for her before she could even open her mouth, smoothly claiming she preferred the pan-seared sea bass because red meat was too heavy for her delicate stomach. Chloe simply stared down at her lap and nodded in silent obedience. The warning sirens in my head grew deafening. when I gently asked Chloe about her sudden, shocking decision to drop out of her university program just 2 months short of finishing her sophomore year. Her breath hitched audibly. She did not look at me to answer. Instead, she looked directly at Julian. It was a fleeting, deeply panicked glance, desperately seeking permission to speak. University is a complete waste of Chloe's highly unique potential. Julian smoothly intervened, his voice like velvet wrapping around a steel wire. His grip tightened imperceptibly on the back of her neck. She is going to help me manage my private international investments. We are building a secure life together, a very protected life, far away from all these unnecessary academic distractions. I kept my face perfectly blank, but inside, my tactical mind was rapidly categorizing his actions. Isolation tactic, severing her vital educational and social ties, speaking for the target to erase her autonomy, controlling her physical movements and dietary choices. Julian was not just a rich, older, controlling boyfriend. He exhibited the textbook, calculated behavior of a high-level psychological manipulator, someone accustomed to wielding absolute control over his assets. Chloe looked incredibly exhausted, her skin pale, trapped in an invisible cage she did not even realize had been systematically locked around her. The dinner dragged on for 2 excruciating hours. I knew I needed a reliable lifeline to my daughter, a way to monitor this highly volatile situation without triggering Julian's obvious paranoia. When the waiter finally brought the dessert menus, I saw my opening. I reached for my water glass and intentionally grazed the edge of the heavy linen napkin resting on my lap, sending it fluttering silently to the plush carpet beneath the table. "Oh, please excuse me," I murmured softly, breaking my eye contact and leaning down beneath the heavy wooden table. In the brief, 3-second window, I was entirely out of sight. My fingers moved with the flawless, muscle-memorized precision of a phantom. I quickly palmed a military-grade micro-tracker, a device no larger than a grain of rice, from the hidden titanium seam of my watch strap. As I sat back up, apologizing for my clumsiness, I smoothly brushed my left hand against the heavy fabric of Julian's expensive wool coat, which was draped over the empty wooden chair right beside him, with a deft, entirely invisible flick of my thumb. The tiny tracker slipped deep into the dark lining of his deep pocket. I placed the napkin back on my lap, folded my hands neatly, and offered the table another mild, vacant smile. Marcus continued to brag loudly about his imaginary empire, completely oblivious to the dangerous predator sitting right across from him. More importantly, Marcus was completely oblivious to the lethal monster sitting right next to him. Let them both believe I am weak. Let them think I am nothing. The hunt had just begun. Exactly 48 hours had passed since that suffocating dinner. The digital clock on my kitchen microwave read 11:30 in the evening. I was quietly wiping down the marble counter, flawlessly playing the role of the mundane suburban woman, when my encrypted burner phone vibrated against my hip. I never used that specific device for my remote data entry job. I only kept it charged and active for one singular, catastrophic reason. I pulled the heavy black device from my pocket. The harsh glare of the screen illuminated the dim kitchen, displaying a single, chilling notification. It was a completely blank text message from Chloe. A second message immediately followed, containing exactly 2 words: Crimson Winter. My blood turned to absolute ice, but my heart rate instantly dropped into a slow, perfectly controlled, and lethal rhythm. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The timid, pushover accountant died right there in that quiet kitchen, and the apex predator finally woke up from her decade-long slumber. Crimson Winter was not a joke or a dramatic overreaction. It was a deeply ingrained failsafe. 7 years ago, under the innocent guise of a fun weekend wilderness survival game, I had relentlessly drilled a series of emergency protocols into my daughter's head. I made her memorize the situational codes until they became pure instinct. Crimson Winter was the absolute highest threat level indicator in our private playbook. It meant the target was facing imminent, unavoidable death, and had zero ability to speak freely or call for outside help. It meant she was trapped, watched, and had perhaps only minutes before the worst possible outcome became reality. I dropped the wet dish towel onto the floor. My footsteps made absolutely no sound as I sprinted swiftly into the dark living room. I approached the massive oak bookshelf spanning the entire back wall of the house. I reached behind a thick, hollowed-out copy of a classic encyclopedia and pressed my right thumb against the smooth, polished wood. A hidden biometric scanner instantly read my unique print. A faint, satisfying mechanical click echoed in the silent room. The entire massive bookshelf slid smoothly and silently to the right, revealing a heavily reinforced steel armory and a state-of-the-art communications terminal. I sat down at the terminal and booted up the secure, off-grid network. My fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard, seamlessly bypassing 3 separate layers of heavy military encryption. I opened a direct, untraceable audio line to my former handler at Meridian Apex Enterprises. The real Meridian Apex, not the fake corporate front Marcus loved to mock. "Director James," a gravelly familiar voice answered on the very first ring. "I need a shadow extraction protocol activated immediately," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. "This is entirely off the books. No federal oversight, no agency red tape, no local law enforcement involvement. This is a personal 0-hour situation, and I am the lead." "Understood completely," my handler replied without a single moment of hesitation or questioning. "What is the current operational landscape?" I pulled up the live feed from the military-grade micro-tracker I had successfully planted deep inside Julian's coat pocket 2 nights ago. The encrypted satellite imagery loaded instantly onto my main monitor. A pulsing red dot glowed angrily on the high-resolution topographical map. The target is located exactly 25 miles outside the city limits. I read the incoming data rapidly, my eyes scanning the terrain. Deep inside the Blackwood Forest sector, the topography shows a massive, isolated private estate. It is completely off the main grid. I am running a thermal scan now. Heat signatures indicate heavy perimeter security. I am counting at least 14 heavily armed hostiles actively patrolling the outer concrete walls, plus multiple guard dogs. There are 2 fortified checkpoints. This is a fortress. "Do you need me to mobilize a full tactical assault squad?" he asked, his fingers clacking over his own keyboard in the background. "No," I replied sharply, standing up and pulling a heavy Kevlar tactical vest from the steel weapons rack beside me. "A large federal footprint will spook the guards and get the hostage killed before we even manage to breach the front gate. I need absolute silence and precision. I need ghosts. Ping the secured communication channels of Vance, Miller, and Thorne. Tell them their debt is being called in tonight. Wheels up in 10 minutes. Those 3 men were not just soldiers. They were former elite deep cover operatives. I had personally pulled each of them out of a burning, compromised black site in Eastern Europe exactly 5 years ago, literally carrying 2 of them on my own shoulders while laying down heavy suppressing fire against an overwhelming enemy force. They owed me their lives, and in our shadow world, a blood debt was an unbreakable, sacred bond. While the handler made the encrypted calls, I began to systematically gear up. I strapped the heavy Kevlar vest tight across my chest, ensuring the ceramic plates were perfectly aligned. I holstered a heavily modified, suppressed tactical handgun onto my right thigh, snapping the retention strap securely. I strapped a backup compact pistol directly to my left ankle. I slid 2 razor-sharp combat knives into the custom sheaths integrated seamlessly into my tactical boots. Finally, I loaded a matte black submachine gun, checking the firing mechanism and the optic sight with brutal, practiced efficiency. Within 3 minutes, my secure terminal beeped sharply. 3 solid green lights appeared on the screen, indicating Vance, Miller, and Thorne had acknowledged the emergency call and were already heavily armed and in transit to the rendezvous coordinates. I grabbed 6 extra high-capacity magazines and secured them tightly to my chest rig. The carefully constructed illusion of my pathetic, quiet, and submissive life was shattered permanently, and I did not care in the slightest. Julian Vance thought he had cleverly isolated a helpless young girl to feed his twisted, sick need for absolute control. He thought he was the smartest, most dangerous man in the room. He was severely, fatally mistaken. He had just dragged my daughter into the dark, completely unaware that her mother owned the shadows. I walked out of the hidden armory, the heavy steel door sealing shut behind me with a loud thud, and headed out into the pitch-black night to hunt. I was standing in the center of my living room, finalizing the synchronized operational frequencies with my extraction team, when the front door chime echoed sharply through the hallway. Before I could even turn my head to check the security monitors, the heavy wooden door was violently shoved open. Marcus possessed a spare key for supposed family emergencies, a privilege I was about to permanently revoke. He stormed right into the entryway, his leather shoes stomping loudly on the hardwood floor. His face was twisted into a scowl of pure irritation, completely oblivious to the lethal atmosphere he had just walked into. He began shouting immediately from the hallway, his voice dripping with his usual obnoxious entitlement. He complained bitterly that Chloe had ignored their scheduled lunch appointment at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He ranted about waiting for 45 minutes at a bistro, claiming his valuable time was being wasted and blaming my parenting skills for her lack of discipline. He marched blindly around the corner into the center of the living room and froze instantly. The arrogant complaints died right in his throat. His expensive designer briefcase slipped from his loose grip, hitting the floor with a dull, heavy thud. My perfectly decorated living room had been entirely transformed into a highly advanced forward operating base. Vance, Miller, and Thorne stood in a tight, disciplined triangle around the large oak coffee table. They were massive men clad in midnight black tactical gear. They were currently racking the heavy steel slides of heavily modified assault rifles, snapping high-capacity ammunition magazines into place, and conducting encrypted radio checks. Marcus stared in absolute, paralyzing horror. The color drained entirely from his face in a matter of seconds, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His jaw dropped open in pure terror. His eyes darted wildly from the lethal tactical explosives spread meticulously across the sofa to the 3 giant mercenaries. And finally, his panicked gaze landed squarely on me. I was strapping a custom combat knife to my thigh, wearing a heavy tactical Kevlar vest. Thorne, a giant with a jagged scar running down his jawline, snapped sharply to attention. He lowered the barrel of his weapon instantly and gave a crisp, deeply respectful nod. "Communications are fully secured. Director James?" Thorne rumbled, his voice gravelly and filled with absolute loyalty. "We await your primary breach command to move out." Hearing that title applied to me broke whatever fragile grip Marcus still had on reality. He let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. His knees buckled slightly, almost sending him crashing to the floor. The reality of the terrifying situation crashed into his massive ego like a runaway freight train. He opened his mouth and began to scream in a hysterical panic, completely losing his mind right there on my rug. I did not give him the chance to make another sound. I moved with a speed he had never witnessed during our 10 years together. I crossed the room in 2 massive strides, grabbed the lapels of his jacket, and slammed him violently backward against the solid plaster wall. The brutal impact knocked the breath forcefully out of his lungs. I pinned him there with a terrifying physical force. I pressed my right forearm incredibly hard against his collarbone, lifting him just enough so his shoes barely scraped the floor. "You will shut your mouth right now," I hissed, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that made his entire body flinch. "If you want to see our daughter alive tomorrow morning, you will stay completely silent. You will do exactly as I say, and you will come with me. Do you understand me?" Marcus could only manage a frantic nod, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was staring at a total stranger, a ruthless predator hiding in the skin of the woman he thought he owned. 15 minutes later, we were moving rapidly down the deserted interstate highway in a heavily armored, matte black tactical transport vehicle that absorbed the surrounding darkness. The interior of the van was pitch dark, illuminated only by the faint, eerie red glow of the GPS tactical monitors. Marcus sat huddled in the far back corner of the reinforced rear bench. He was pulled into a tight, trembling ball, looking completely pathetic and incredibly small. I watched him briefly through the dark reflection of the reinforced ballistic window. I could visibly see the agonizing realization washing over his pale face. He was finally comprehending the devastating truth that our entire 10-year marriage had been a flawlessly constructed act. The timid accountant he had spent a decade mocking was a complete fabrication. He realized he was currently sharing a confined space with professional killers who treated his supposedly weak ex-wife like a reigning deity of war. I turned my attention away from his miserable, shaking form and focused my mind entirely on the upcoming mission parameters. I looked back at Marcus one last time, deciding he needed to fully understand the gravity of the terrifying nightmare his willful ignorance had helped facilitate. "Julian is not a brilliant technology investor," I stated coldly, my harsh voice cutting sharply through the low hum of the heavy diesel engine. "He has never funded a single legitimate startup in his entire miserable life. He is a ruthless money launderer for an international arms trafficking syndicate. He cleans hundreds of millions of dollars in dirty money for cartels and warlords across the globe. And right now, his criminal organization is hunting him. So he is using Chloe as a human shield to negotiate his own survival." Marcus let out a weak, pathetic whimper, immediately burying his face deep in his trembling hands, entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of his own spectacular blindness. The heavy armored transport ground to a completely silent halt exactly 1/2 mile from the outer concrete perimeter of the estate. I raised my left hand, clenching my fist to signal the extraction team to hold their positions. The air was frigid, thick with the scent of damp pine needles and impending violence. Thorne pulled a highly modified electronic warfare tablet from his chest rig and initiated the blackout sequence, disabling the main power grid and all backup generators in 3, 2, 1. Thorne whispered through the encrypted earpiece. In absolute unison, every single light illuminating the massive, sprawling private estate vanished. The fortress was instantly plunged into pitch-black darkness. We pulled down our military-grade night vision optics. The world shifted into a sharp, terrifying spectrum of neon green. I drew the suppressed tactical handgun from my thigh holster and moved forward into the tree line. We were no longer human beings. We were lethal phantoms. The perimeter guards never even realized they were under attack. Vance and Miller flanked the left steel gate, moving with terrifying fluidity. They neutralized 2 heavily armed sentries simultaneously, using silent, bone-snapping close-quarters combat techniques that dropped the men to the cold ground before their fingers could even twitch toward their radio triggers. I took the right flank. A massive guard turned the corner of the stone wall, his flashlight sweeping the dark grass. I closed the 20-foot distance in exactly 3 seconds. I swept his legs out from under him, catching his heavy body as he fell, and applied a flawless, oxygen-depriving carotid chokehold. He was completely unconscious in under 6 seconds. I lowered him silently to the turf. We breached the heavy side door of the main mansion using a silent thermal cutter. Inside, the grand hallways were cavernous and completely dark. I took the lead, navigating the complex labyrinth of corridors without a single moment of hesitation. During the 15-minute transport ride, my photographic memory had perfectly downloaded and mapped every single square inch of the architectural blueprints. I knew exactly where every load-bearing wall, blind spot, and ventilation shaft was located. 2 hostiles approaching from the grand staircase. I signaled with sharp, precise hand gestures to the team behind me. I slipped behind a massive marble pillar. As the first guard stepped past my position, I grabbed the barrel of his assault rifle, violently twisting it upward to break his grip, and drove the heavy steel pommel of my combat knife squarely into the nerve cluster behind his ear. He collapsed instantly. Thorne caught the second guard by the throat from the shadows, silencing him permanently before a single cry could escape. Marcus was stumbling clumsily right behind me, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He kept tripping over his own expensive leather shoes. Every time I looked back to ensure he was keeping up, I could see the absolute, mind-shattering horror etched deeply into his pale face. The woman he had spent 3,650 days mocking, the woman he treated like a pathetic, weak-minded servant, was currently snapping the bones of heavily armed cartel mercenaries with the cold, unfeeling precision of a machine. The illusion of his superiority was being violently shredded right in front of his eyes. He watched me clear the eastern wing of the mansion without breaking my stride or increasing my heart rate. He was completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization of who he had actually been married to for a decade. We finally reached the subterranean level. The blueprints indicated a heavily fortified, soundproof safe room at the end of a long concrete corridor. The heavy reinforced steel door was locked tight with a highly advanced biometric security pad. Thorne stepped forward, applying a specialized corrosive chemical compound directly to the internal wiring. The locking mechanism dissolved and gave way in exactly 14 seconds. I kicked the heavy steel door open and rushed into the room. The space was illuminated only by the harsh, glaring blue light of a single laptop monitor. Chloe was huddled in the far corner, weeping hysterically, her entire body shaking with pure terror. Her fingers were flying desperately across the keyboard. Connected to the laptop was a thick, silver external hard drive. She had accidentally stumbled upon Julian's encrypted master ledger. She had found the undeniable, digitized proof of his massive international money laundering and weapons trafficking syndicate, and she was frantically trying to crack the encryption to secure the data as her only leverage to stay alive. "Chloe!" I called out sharply, pulling the heavy tactical helmet off my head and tossing it to the floor. She spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face completely soaked in tears. "Mom?" she choked out, her voice cracking in a mix of shock and overwhelming relief. She launched herself across the room and crashed directly into my arms. I held my daughter incredibly tight, wrapping my arms around her shaking frame, pressing her head safely against the heavy ceramic plates of my tactical vest. I smoothed her hair, feeling the terrifyingly rapid beat of her heart against my chest. Our emotional reunion lasted for exactly 4 seconds. Without a single sound of warning, the solid wood paneling on the right side of the room violently exploded outward. Splinters of wood and chunks of drywall rained down as a hidden, reinforced security door was kicked open from the other side. Julian Vance stepped confidently through the settling dust. He was no longer wearing his expensive tailored suit. He was dressed in a dark combat shirt, and he held a highly customized automatic submachine gun tightly in his hands. He raised the weapon, leveling the black barrel directly at the center of my forehead. He let out a loud, maniacal bark of laughter that echoed sharply against the soundproof walls. His cold eyes danced with arrogant, sadistic amusement. Well, 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 Julian sneered, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. The boring little suburban mother comes to the very desperate rescue. How incredibly touching and utterly pathetic. You actually thought you could just sneak into my personal fortress? I have spent over $25 million building this impenetrable security grid. I knew the sudden power cut was a perimeter breach the second it happened. He took a slow, menacing step closer, completely intoxicated by his own perceived dominance and absolute power. He kept the weapon aimed squarely at my skull. He was grinning like a victorious king who had just trapped a helpless mouse. He had absolutely no idea that his $25 million security system had just been surgically dismantled in under 8 minutes. He was loudly boasting about his own genius, completely fatally blind to the terrifying reality that he had just locked himself inside a concrete box with the most dangerous monster he would ever encounter in his entire pathetic life. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I slowly and deliberately raised my empty hands, showing Julian that my palms were completely bare. I stepped forward, purposefully placing my body directly between the barrel of his automatic weapon and my family. I reached behind my back with my left arm, firmly grabbing Chloe by the shoulder and pushing her roughly backward into the far corner of the concrete room. I shoved Marcus right next to her. My ex-husband was trembling so violently his teeth were audibly chattering. but I ignored his pathetic presence entirely. I stood completely unarmed in the center of the subterranean safe room, facing down a fully loaded submachine gun, yet the heavy air in the room shifted instantly. The suffocating killing intent radiating from my posture was so overwhelmingly dense that Julian subconsciously took a half-step backward. He still held the gun aimed directly at my skull, his finger resting nervously on the trigger guard. He opened his mouth to deliver another arrogant, self-serving monologue, but I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. My voice was no longer the soft, timid whisper of a suburban accountant. It was a weaponized, icy command that struck like physical blows. Cayman Islands offshore routing number 847-291-005, I recited clearly, the numbers echoing sharply off the soundproof walls. Registered under the shell corporation Apex Holdings International. Current balance as of 1 hour ago was exactly $42,500,000. Zurich Shadow account number 77 Alpha 93 Bravo. Registered under a fake agricultural export front. Holding over 112 million euros. Julian's arrogant, mocking smile completely froze on his face. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. The barrel of his submachine gun dipped down about 2 inches as pure confusion began to violently override his sadistic confidence. He stared at me, trying to process how a supposedly boring suburban mother could possibly possess highly classified financial data that only his highest-tier cartel bosses knew about. You own a secret fortified safe house situated in the remote mountains outside Bogota, purchased last November using a proxy buyer, I continued relentlessly, taking one slow, deliberate step closer to him. You maintain a secondary extraction point in a luxury penthouse overlooking the harbor in Dubai. But more importantly, Julian, I know exactly who supplies your merchandise. I know the real names of the Petrovic brothers operating out of Serbia. I know the exact shipping routes they use to smuggle heavy munitions through the Mediterranean ports. I know about the massive weapons shipments scheduled to arrive in Naples in exactly 48 hours. The smugness was completely wiped from his face now. His skin turned the color of wet ash. His dark, cold eyes widened into saucers of absolute terror. He was no longer looking at a helpless victim. He was staring directly into the abyss, and the abyss was reading his deepest, darkest secrets aloud. "How do you know those names?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking horribly, the false velvet tone entirely stripped away. "That information is kept on a closed, offline network. It is impossible to access. Nobody knows those names. Nothing is impossible when you invite the architect of the system to your family dinner," I stated, my tone entirely devoid of any mercy or human empathy. Meridian Apex Enterprises is not a boring data entry firm. Julian, we are a highly classified shadow financial intelligence agency operating strictly off the books for the global intelligence community. We trace the money that funds terrorism, human trafficking, and international arms syndicates. We do not arrest people like you. We completely erase you. And during the short 15-minute drive to this pathetic little fortress, I personally breached your heavily encrypted master ledger using the tracker I planted on you. I did not just look at your money. I took all of it. Julian gasped loudly, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had just been sucked entirely out of the room. "I have systematically frozen every single illegal asset you possess," I told him, watching the light of hope die completely in his eyes. "I initiated a cascading digital siphon through the dark web. Every last cent of your cartel blood money, across 32 different international shell accounts, has already been legally transferred into an untouchable federal forfeiture fund. You are entirely bankrupt. You have absolutely nothing left to negotiate with, and you have no money to pay your private army standing outside." He shook his head wildly, panic fully setting in. His hands were shaking so severely that the metal parts of his weapon rattled loudly against each other. He knew exactly what this meant. In his dark, violent world, a money launderer who lost the syndicate's money was a dead man walking. I had not just ruined his comfortable life, I had practically signed his horrific, inescapable death warrant. From the dark corner behind me, Marcus watched this entire psychological execution unfold. He was paralyzed, completely flattened against the cold concrete wall. For 10 years, he had truly believed he was the most powerful, intelligent man in any room he entered. He had spent thousands of days belittling my career, calling me a pathetic keyboard monkey who was too weak to survive in the real corporate world. Now, he was watching me absolutely crush the will of a hardened, international criminal mastermind using nothing but words and terrifying intellect. He saw a man who routinely dealt with global cartels reduced to a shaking, broken shell of a human being in under 3 minutes. Marcus suddenly realized how incredibly pathetic, small, and utterly stupid he truly was. His booming real estate firm, his bragging about $5 million deals, it was all nothing compared to the shadow empires I dismantled silently before my morning coffee. He felt a wave of absolute shame wash over his miserable soul. I reached into the deep tactical pocket of my Kevlar vest and pulled out a heavy steel stopwatch. I clicked the top button with my right thumb. A harsh, mechanical ticking sound joined the heavy, terrified breathing in the room. I held it up so Julian could clearly see the face of the watch, ticking away his final moments of freedom. "The men whose money I just stole are already actively looking for you," I said coldly, my eyes locking onto his terrified, shifting gaze. "They just received an anonymous, completely untraceable encrypted file containing your precise global positioning coordinates and the master security codes to bypass this estate. I have turned you into a penniless, hunted animal, and your own syndicate is currently on their way to collect your head." Julian swallowed hard, taking another stumbling step back until his shoulders hit the broken wooden doorframe. He looked around wildly, but there was nowhere to run. "I am giving you exactly 10 seconds, I commanded, raising my voice to a sharp, authoritative bark that demanded absolute, unquestioning compliance. 10 seconds to drop that weapon on the floor, kick it toward me, and drop to your knees with your hands locked tightly behind your head. If you surrender to me right now, I will hand you over to the federal tactical units waiting outside, and you might get to spend the rest of your miserable life breathing inside a maximum security cell. If you refuse, I will walk out of here with my daughter. Seal this vault tightly behind me, and let the cartel skin you alive. The choice is yours. The clock is ticking. 9, 8, 7. Julian's mind violently snapped under the crushing weight of his total annihilation, cornered, bankrupt, and facing certain death at the hands of the very cartels he once served. The last remaining shreds of his sanity completely evaporated. He let out a deafening, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated madness. His face contorted into a mask of absolute hatred, and he yanked the heavy trigger of the submachine gun, aiming directly for the center of my chest, fully intending to drag me down into the abyss with him. But I was not there when the weapon fired, before the first deafening crack of a gunshot could even rip through the air. My body moved with a terrifying, explosive kinetic speed honed from decades of surviving the deadliest combat zones on Earth. I dropped my center of gravity instantly, slipping precisely underneath his line of fire. The barrage of bullets chewed harmlessly into the thick concrete wall behind me. In the exact same fluid motion, I pivoted hard on my left heel, closing the tiny gap between us. My right hand shot upward, gripping the burning hot barrel of his weapon and violently forcing it toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, my left arm hooked aggressively under his right elbow. With a vicious, brutal twist of my entire torso, I executed a flawless, devastating joint lock. The horrific sound of popping cartilage and snapping bone echoed sickeningly in the confined space. Julian screamed in absolute agony as his arm bent backward at an unnatural angle. The weapon slipped uselessly from his deadened fingers. I did not stop. I swept my leg firmly behind his knees and drove my full body weight downward, slamming his massive frame face first into the hard concrete floor with a bone-jarring impact that actually cracked the solid cement beneath his jaw. I pressed my knee heavily into his spine, pinning him entirely to the ground, pulling his broken arm up to ensure he could not even twitch without experiencing blinding pain. At that exact second, The sound of exploding glass and shattering wood erupted from the upper levels of the estate. The heavy federal tactical units I had secretly signaled right before entering the subterranean level had finally breached the perimeter. Heavily armed agents swarmed into the safe room, their tactical flashlights cutting through the settling dust. They forcefully grabbed the groaning, broken Julian from under my knee. They wrenched his arms behind his back, securing heavy steel cuffs around his wrists, and dragged him harshly to his feet. The once untouchable, arrogant criminal mastermind was reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess, paraded out of his own fallen fortress in absolute crushing humiliation. As the agents cleared the room, Chloe rushed forward from the dark corner. She collapsed against me, burying her face deep into my chest, crying with loud, heavy sobs that shook her entire body. The cold, ruthless operator who had just dismantled an international syndicate vanished in an instant. I wrapped my arms around my daughter, holding her tighter than I ever had in my entire life. I gently stroked her tangled hair, whispering soft, fierce words of comfort into her ear. The dark, violent reality of my hidden profession had surrounded me for years, but in that moment, I proved that no amount of blood or shadow could ever erode the pure, sacred, and fiercely protective maternal love I held for my child. 30 minutes later, we were standing outside the massive stone gates of the ruined estate. The pre-dawn sky was just beginning to turn a soft purple, but the immediate area was bathed in the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of dozens of federal vehicles. I was wrapping a warm thermal blanket around Chloe's shoulders when I heard tentative footsteps approaching from behind. I turned slowly to see Marcus. He looked completely shattered. His expensive designer clothes were covered in dirt. His hair was a wild mess, and his face carried the hollow, devastated look of a man whose entire universe had just been fundamentally overturned. He stopped a few feet away, his hands trembling violently. "Harper," he croaked, his voice cracking with a desperate, overwhelming agony. "I am so sorry. For everything. For the last 10 years. I was so arrogant. I treated you like you were nothing. I insulted you. I hurt you. I was a complete fool. And I am so incredibly sorry." I looked straight into his red, tear-filled eyes. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a deep, chilling wave of pity. "You never hurt me, Marcus," I replied, my voice calm, flat, and completely devoid of any lingering emotion. "Your pathetic insults and your desperate need to feel superior never once bothered me. Do you know why? Because a lion never loses a single moment of sleep worrying about the opinions of a sheep." His breath hitched sharply. The absolute truth of my words hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. He finally understood that he had never even been a participant in my world. I turned away from him without waiting for a response. I placed my arms securely around Chloe's waist, guiding her gently away from the flashing lights and the wreckage of the night. We walked together down the quiet road, stepping forward into the warm light of the breaking sunrise. I left Marcus standing entirely alone in the cold shadows, forced to spend the rest of his miserable life drowning in the agonizing regret of knowing he had completely lost the greatest, most powerful woman he had never even bothered to truly understand. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1